You do, I can see that. We don't have that, but
Hello, everyone. I'm glad that the threat of terrible weather has not deterred you from coming this evening. I understand there are more threats, but we've been getting them all week, so. I am the Director of Education. I'm Carmen Smith, and it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. Zahira Valis is Senior Paintings Curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. Before joining the MFA in 2012, she worked for 30 years as an independent restorer and curator for a number of the world's leading museums and institutions, including the National Trust in England, the Royal Foundation of Toledo in Spain, and the Prado in Madrid. In the mid-'80s, Dr. Veliz worked with legendary restorer John Brealey while he was head conservator at the Prado. Later, they would work together to restore El Greco's famous painting, The Disrobing of Christ, for the Cathedral of Toledo. We were talking earlier that it has just undergone a very substantial restoration, and some of you I know went to the Prado last year to see that, so it's quite outstanding. So her hand is in that as well. In addition to directing international teams and cultural institutions throughout Spain, Dr. Veliz has served as a restorer for many private collections as well, many major private collections, including the Abello collection, which she indicated she also worked on, and there are a number of works upstairs that she has had the privilege of working with. Dr. Veliz has written extensively on art conservation, technical art history, and 17th century paintings and drawings. She's lectured internationally and taught at University College in London, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and the Courtauld Institute of Art, where she received her PhD. This evening, Dr. Veliz will talk about the 15th and 16th century Spanish masters in the Abello collection upstairs in our galleries. Please welcome Zahira Veliz.
Well, good evening. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and thank you very much, Carmen, for your generous introduction. I have crossed paths with the Abello collection earlier in my life, and it's just such a thrill to see this collection, which has grown since I had any involvement with it, to be really one of the most important 20th century collections assembled by a private collector almost anywhere. The range and the consistent taste and judgment that's shown across 6 centuries and a number of different schools of painting, I think, is almost without parallel. So it's a great honor, really, to be asked to help to celebrate its presence here in Dallas. So my personal connection with the Abello pictures goes back to a period in the late 1970s and 80s when I was working in Spain. Having recently trained as a conservator, I threw all my belongings into one footlocker and one suitcase and threw in New York and said, I have to go where art still is where it was meant to be. And it was rather difficult getting a foothold in Spain in those years, and I did a lot of work in remote country places on conservation campaigns, on scaffoldings in front of altarpieces that could not be taken down. And I would say that almost through that experience, rather than any subsequent museum-based experiences, I really came to love the authenticity that I encountered in Spanish 15th century panel painting. So that is why I have chosen to talk about panel painting. So that's the first thing that the works I want to talk about have got in common. There are any number of narratives that could be constructed around any of the paintings in the Abello collection. But as I'm speaking a little bit as a conservator, a little bit as an art historian, certainly very, very much as a lover of Spanish art, I thought to talk to you about 3 panels in a little bit of depth and about the artists who made them would be something I could share with you tonight. So, okay, the 3 panels, I guess we could have the lights a little bit dimmed now. I'm going to go to the next slide. Okay, thank you. The 3 panels that I'm going to talk to you about are Pedro Berruguete's Virgin and Child enthroned at your left, the Baptism of Christ by Juan de Flandes in the center, and Yáñez de la Almedina's amazing devotional picture of Christ as Salvator Mundi with St. Peter and St. John the Evangelist. Okay, you'll see, first of all 3 of them are religious subjects. Some of the other things that the 3 panels have in common is that their artists all experienced the impact of travel. And Texas is a big state, so you know what it means to cross big distances. In the 15th century, to go from any place to any place in Spain, you were crossing a pretty reasonable distance. And for the two Spanish artists who actually left Spain for a period of time and then returned, it was a big undertaking. For Juan de Flandes, the artist of the central panel, who left his native Flanders and went to Spain and never returned, that was also, not very many people did that kind of mobility, undertook that kind of commitment to go and live in a completely different country. We know, maybe a few dozen artists in the Renaissance period who really did move to another completely different culture and establish themselves there. Another thing the artists have in common is that we actually don't know very much about them. We have very limited documentation in Spain prior to really towards the end of Isabel's reign. That's when the kind of plan for keeping archival documents and keeping records of transactions was really formalized. So if anybody's researching a subject post about 1495 or 1500, you're much more likely to find original documents. Earlier documents, because Spain was such a sort of demographically fluid patchwork sort of place, it's very hard to find sort of consistent series of documents. So to get facts about these artists is quite a challenge, because they weren't kings and queens signing treaties and marriage agreements and political alliances. They were working artists, and their appearance in documentation is very, very fragile. You can miss the whole existence of somebody in terms of documents in this early period. So both Pedro Berruguete, the artist of this panel, and Yáñez are believed to have been in Italy. But in both cases, the documentary evidence is literally one line in Italian documents. Pedro Berruguete, we think, is the Pietro Spagnolo, who was a witness in a legal contract in Urbino, and he's described as Pietro Spagnolo Pittore, painter. So we're hoping that there's a whole theory and history of this artist that hangs on that little hook. And with Yáñez de la Almedina, we believe, he seems to be the artist called Ferrando Spagnolo, who was working with Leonardo and received some payment for working alongside of Leonardo da Vinci on a project in Florence. We know a little bit more about them in Spain, but not a great deal. So they're all three, but especially the two artists on the outside, men of mystery. Nevertheless, although we don't have a lot of documentary knowledge about them, art historians have labored really over the last 200 years, bringing together bodies of work that hang together with personality and that can be attached by some additional documentary knowledge in Spain to that personality or to this personality. And so the oeuvre, the body of work that at any given time for these artists is a slightly changeable feast. One decade it might include 55 paintings, and the next decade somebody says, no, it only contains 45 paintings. So we're still trying to get the full contour of these artistic personalities. Another thing that these three artists have in common, despite the little that we know about them in terms of their documentary reality and the fluidity of their corpus of work, we still identify strong artistic personalities. And I think that in their body of work, and especially very well represented in the Abello collection shown here, we can distinguish some of the traits that will really become absolutely characteristic for the Spanish school as it develops throughout the 16th and especially through the 17th century. And that's, I think, an area that has escaped a lot of art historians because it's not easy to pin down what is it that makes these panels Spanish panels and not an Italian panel and not a Flemish panel. Yes, we know a little bit from the documentary point of view and the provenance point of view, but is there something else that makes them Spanish and not Flemish and not Italian? So those are some of the themes I'd like to follow this evening, but before we go to that, I must just pay tribute to the fact that we're talking about paintings on panel. That means these are paintings applied to a piece of wood. And their physical reality, I think, is something that's not always easy to perceive when we look at the amazing creations, the images that have been conjured on their surfaces and that have endured these hundreds and hundreds of years. So, okay, I'm just going to ask you to concentrate on this side first. This is a cross-section of a panel painting. Think of it as a sort of schematic, you know, if it were a human being, it would be a stick figure. But this is if we could look through the panel from the side, we would see the wooden panel down here. Those are the growth rings that you see of different sizes. Then there's a kind of sealant put onto the panel, or in this case, onto the canvas, to prevent the wood absorbing all of the medium that the artist later will put on. And in the case of panel paintings, there's there's a considerable layer of gesso, which has to be applied and smoothed before it can be painted on. I'm not going to talk anymore about canvases, so we're going to leave the canvas at the side now. I'm just going to show you the difference in texture in the surface that can be achieved in panels or canvas is really important. And also important to remember is that until about 1550, well over 95% of every painting made in Western Europe was painted on panel. Canvas paint, the technology to make rich color last on canvas really wasn't developed until about the middle of it wasn't established until about the middle of the 16th century. So everywhere, whether it was in Italy or Flanders or Spain or England, there was a local technology related to using wood in that area with specialist knowledge and understanding of the environment there and where things would be installed. All of that was part of the knowledge that went into the making of these things. And this is, this is actually a Spanish panel by Luis Morales, and you can see how highly polished the surface is, but you can still just perceive across the light some of the panel grain. In contrast, with canvas, it's much more difficult to eliminate the presence of the surface texture. So this is the kind of work that goes into smoothing this layer, the gesso layer, so that it can be smooth enough to receive paint and create an illusion, you know, so that it doesn't look like a piece of rough wood with paint on it. These artists were interested in ever greater success at creating the illusion of visible reality. And this is, I'm sorry, this is a very old slide that's out of focus, but it shows how much larger sometimes the panel surface was that was prepared than was actually painted, because this artist, who was working in central Spain in about 1540, knew that that much of the panel would be covered by tracery in the altarpiece. So why would he spend expensive paint painting out to the edges. On top of that gesso layer, very often we find in this period underdrawing. And here you see, this is an infrared image of the preparatory drawing that the artist did directly on the panel. So this is the lower edge of that mantle, and all of this detail was drawn under here, even though the surface is much more smoothly covered with paint. By using infrared reflectography, the camera can actually capture, it's really an image of absorption or reflection of heat waves of the infrared part of the spectrum. And that kind of illumination can pick up differences at lower levels in the painting structure. It can actually penetrate. Uh-oh, how do I do this? Can I go backwards? It penetrates to about that level there, through the paint layers to the top of the ground layer. So later on, I'll show you one or two examples of underdrawing by the artist we're going to be looking at. And then the artist is ready to paint. Here is a female artist painting a self-portrait. There's her little mirror. Here's the panel. You can see it's a three-dimensional object with the depth there, her edge of gesso, and here are her colors and her brushes. And again, just a reminder of the paint structure and the differences between a rich, medium rich paint layer, where there's much more medium than pigment, and up at the top, oops, sorry. Oh. Anyway, I'll leave that slide. My technology is letting me down here. And then here we have, I just wanted you to see that those little bowls of color that the artist had next to her as she was painting her little self-portrait were not very easily produced. A lot of work went into having little saucers of paint. And many of the earlier paintings in Italy and Spain would have been painted with egg tempera. And egg tempera is the middle of the egg yolk. So you have to hold on to the egg yolk and have the contents fall down into a little bowl, mix it with water, and then you grind it up with a lot of work to make sure that all of the pigment is well dispersed. You see again, so that you have a nice, even kind of paint that will flow off the brush. So all of this was done without electricity, without light at night, and it was very labor intensive. So all of this is really to let you, this slide shows you the same sort of utensils but used for oil paint. And that some of the materials actually start out like this. I mean, an artist would buy a piece of blue rock and then begin to grind it down and refine it until he could use it as a blue colorant. So the amount of labor that lies behind the kinds of images that you're seeing here. This is the Wilton diptych, dated 1399, and the Marriage of the Arnolfini, 1424. Thousands of hours of preparation went into these works. And that's part of the reason they're not only precious because they are such beautiful images, they took, in the economy of the day, they took a lot of work. They were special objects, and they were made to last. The Wilton diptych, although it was made in Northern Europe, is pure egg tempera. The Marriage of the Arnolfini, made just a quarter of a century later, is pure linseed oil. And some of the qualities that you get with tempera, it's quite high key. It's basically watercolor with a lot of body, and it's got a protein binder, so when it dries, it's very, very permanent. Oil paint retains transparency. So there was a whole new way of painting. When it was discovered how to use oil paint and exploit the possibilities for creating jewel-like transparency on the top of on paintings, it opened up a whole new arena of aesthetics. In tempera, it's because it dries very quickly, it's more difficult to make corrections. It's possible to make corrections, but it's more difficult. Oil paint, in that sense, is the most forgiving medium. We'll see later on another painting that was done by one of our artists in an unforgiving medium. So, what did these artists paint in? Of our three paintings, the Berruguete, Virgin and Child, is probably in a mixed medium. It's early enough in the 15th century that there are not many purely linseed oil paintings in Spain yet. There are in the Low Countries. Made in Spain. There might be some completely linseed oil paintings imported into Spain. The other two paintings, Juan de Flandes and Yáñez, are pure oil technique. So these panels are extremely precious objects produced from a huge amount of labor, and we're really looking at works that were created kind of at a threshold of a new, the exploration by artists of a new medium. What could oil paint provide besides being easier to correct? It really is responsible for the jewel-like beauty of the colors that we still see today in these paintings. It's very high quality pigments. These were all expensive commissions, and the oil involved here has really helped to retain the transparency of the paint layer to allow light to reverberate in the color and come back out to our eyes. Juan de Flandes, and this is especially true here in the sort of exploitation of complementary colors to give zing to the, just to enjoy the use of color. Juan de Flandes, as a Flemish trained artist, born in Bruges or Ghent and trained there before he came to Madrid as a fully formed artist, came to Spain as a fully formed artist, has developed the skill to create atmospheric perspective. And that's really something that the oil painters of the northern 15th century were the first ones to clinch. And that would not have been as easily achievable in fresco or tempera because there's no transparency. It doesn't have the kind of ethereal transparency that you can achieve with oil glazes. And in the case of Yáñez, one of his contributions to the Spanish visual vocabulary was the use of the further exploitation of the oil medium for sfumato, sort of very blended brushwork and soft shadows that blended from highlight into the deepest shadow in a very, very smooth way. We term that as sfumato, which means kind of smokiness in Italian, and it's used in art to describe some of the sort of transitions that are softest, here between the highlight of St. John's cheek coming down to there. Those are some of the characteristics of Italian technique in oil that Yáñez helped to import into Spain. And you can see, in the Meadows collection, you've got a very, very splendid Yáñez, the St. Sebastian, where within the flesh tones, all over the shadows and the halftones, you see the use of this kind of blended exploitation of this blending ability that's possible with oil. Okay, now we're getting to the Isabel the Catholic stage of my talk. Isabel was obviously a huge, huge influence on the culture and society where these artists worked. Isabel, somewhat unexpectedly, became Queen of Castile after a couple of key relatives died. And she, like her predecessors on the thrones of Castile or Leon maintained an itinerant court. They were constantly moving around, partly to flex their muscles, but also there wasn't really one set urban center, because Spain, as you'll see in a couple of slides, I'll show you the reconquest of Spain from the Muslim kingships that held most of the Spanish peninsula, of the Iberian Peninsula in 756, I mean about 98% of it, were only slowly, over the next sort of 800 years, pushed little by little down to the Mediterranean, and then finally completely reconquered. It was under Isabel's reign that the Kingdom of Granada, which was the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, was conquered. And to Isabel, that was much more important. It was much more part of her sort of goal as a monarch, as a leader of her country. That was much more important to her than having underwritten Columbus's voyage to America. So, there's a really different perspective about that. And of course, she didn't know how much would happen as a result of his trip. But her achievement in reconquering Granada was for her the great goal of her monarchy. So she was moving around. The court moved around. There were no urban centers that were sufficiently developed economically to support a strong local school. For 100 years, Central Spain, Castile and Leon had imported artists. They brought artists from France, from many people surnamed Picardy in Spain, from the Low Countries, and increasingly they imported Northern art. So Isabel's grandfather and father were both interested in Northern art, and they brought fine examples of Netherlandish painting to Spain. The kind of patronage that Isabel and Ferdinand liked to do was mostly related to monastic or ecclesiastical foundations. Occasionally, we will discuss a couple of private commissions that Isabel did, but usually it was to found a monastery or a convent, and then endow the people who would be occupying those religious houses and praying for the monarchy, praying for the people of the Spanish Peninsula for all the time to come. So besides the reconquest, the unification of much of the Iberian Peninsula between the Kingdom of Aragon over here, which was Ferdinand's realm, and all of this part of right down to the Mediterranean there and up to the Bay of Biscay came under Isabel's rule. Together, they created a largely unified Iberian Peninsula. In order to put personal stamp, in a lot of ways, Isabel is one of the most intriguing sort of first modern ruler, because she really grasped the importance of establishing a sort of putting her personal stamp on the way her country was going to function. She was self-fashioning in the artists she chose, in the kinds of art she commissioned, and in the patronage that she exercised. Witnesses from her time describe her as pious, austere, modest, very dignified, a strong judge. I think that might be a diplomatic way of saying judgmental. She was pretty severe, but that she was very pure of heart. Even people who didn't have any particular vested interest in flattering her felt that she was very authentic in her piety and in her will and desire to do good for her domains. So I'll just show you very quickly she also was truly, truly a woman on the move. Those arrows are showing you where she traveled only in the first year of being queen. There's more, Valladolid, Palencia. Okay, I know that they spent New Year's Eve of 1476 here. About Isabel, we know quite a bit. I wish we knew more about the artists. So she, and that was just the beginning. You know, she was on the move. I don't know if anybody has ever charted, you know, every place that she slept through the 30-so years of her reign, but she was on the move all the time. Only in the last year of her life, after being queen, only in the last year of her life, she spent a whole year at Medina del Campo, which is here, because she was too ill to move. But otherwise, she was up and down. She, you know, was on hand at Granada during a 10-year military siege. And you'll see from upstairs some of the paintings you must know and love, but the Beruete landscapes of central Spain. It was not an easy task moving around that much. The next slide is just going to show you very quickly the why this final conquest of Granada down here was such a huge achievement for Isabel. Starting in the year 756, the only part of Spain that was not in Muslim hands was this little stripe up here at the top next to the Bay of Biscay. And little by little, that's the frontier as it was pushed down century by century, until finally Isabel was the monarch who was at the helm when the reconquest was complete. And I think it's worth adding that in medieval Spain, yes, there were battles, you know, there was some religious conflict, but an awful lot of it was political expediency. You know, there was a lot of coexistence, you know, Toledo, Salamanca, you know, many cities in the south, you know, there were Jewish, Muslim, and Christian communities all coexisting and even intermarrying. Nevertheless, it was Isabel's, I mean, there was always, you know, the peninsula had been under Christian kingship before it was invaded in the 8th century. And so the Christian monarchs who were driven up into the north did feel that they had, you know, a right to reconquer the peninsula which they had originally and historically occupied. Nevertheless, the legacy of Muslim culture is felt still today, and it's resonant everywhere in Spain. You know, so many words, so many surnames are still in fact from Arabic. Isabel had a very interesting distribution of people who worked for her. All of her carpenters and embroiderers were Spaniards with Arabic surnames. And I found this also working in Spain when you look at the documents for who were the people who actually built the churches, who were the people who actually built the altarpieces in the very early modern period. I mean, in the 15th century or late medieval period, I should say, they're all Muslim, you know, Arabic surnames. So there were obviously great sort of depths of skill that were passed down, you know, within these sort of subcultures. However, all of Isabel's artists were Flemish. The artists whom she patronized individually were Flemish artists, or certainly artists who were very skilled at working in a Flemish or Gothicizing manner. So next, okay, Juan de Flandes, oh, I have to do this, sorry, came from the Low Countries and stayed in Spain. I'll have you know, this is the first animated PowerPoint I have ever done. I'm feeling incredibly proud. That's Juan de Flandes, who came to Spain sometime before, around 1495-96. He's seriously, you know, definitely documented from 1496, but Isabel paid his relocation costs. And we don't know where the relocation was from, but there's certainly no sign of him in Spain before about 1495-96. So we're assuming that she actually called him from the Low Countries through some intermediary to come and be an artist at her court. And by late 1496, she had made him her own court artist, named him court artist. Okay, next we have, that's Pedro Berruguete with the probable trip to Italy, possibly lasting as long as 1470 to 1485, depending on which scholar you're looking at. And then back again to Castile, where he spent the rest of his life. And then Yáñez, who came from the Kingdom of Aragon actually he came from this part of Castile, but his working life was mostly in Valencia or in this area of Spain, of Castile. And then he went to central Italy also, definitely to Florence, we believe. We don't know where else he might have been. And he came back too. Some art historians have done a lot of work looking at Yáñez de la Almedina, trying to work out through identifying Italian works of art that he must have seen to paint the way he did. You know, sometimes a figure, sometimes a landscape that he's actually imported into a Spanish work that he can only have seen in a certain Italian location. So that's kind of serious detective work, but very, very interesting to do. Okay, so next, where were these panels made for? You've got some beautiful early small altarpieces installed in the galleries upstairs, in the permanent galleries. So obviously you're familiar with what an altarpiece is. There were many different kinds. Here we have, this is a big altarpiece painted by Pedro Berruguete. That's documented. We know he did it. And this is the Church of St. Thomas. It's a convent church in Avila. So this altarpiece was painted and designed, architecturally designed and painted. The paintings were designed to influence a huge space. It was going to be perceived from, 80 meters away. It wasn't an intimate object. On the other hand, our Berruguete that's upstairs was designed for an intimate space. This is actually Ferdinand and Isabel's own private chapel in their in the Alcázar of Seville, which was their royal palace in Seville. So in that sort of space, only one or a very few people would fit. And so the relationship of the viewer to the work of art is much more intimate, and the devotional purpose of having art in that setting is very different from the sort of great pronouncement of a huge piece like this. So all the three panels that I'm focusing on have all been extracted from those contexts, and they're recontextualized every time they're exhibited now. I mean, they have one context in Mr. Abello's house. They're recontextualized here in Texas, surrounded by other works of that period. We see them every time in a slightly different way. But I think it's always important to remember what their original purpose was and under what conditions they were originally designed to be seen. The iconography of the Berruguete is very, very concentrated. Again, paintings were made, these paintings were made for an educated audience. They possibly for somebody like Isabel or a member of her court, or certainly someone from a sort of religiously educated class and who could afford a painting of this quality. The iconography at first glance looks like the mother and child, but as we look at it more closely, we find that there is a kind of intense layering of meaning. First of all, it's not just Mary with the baby Jesus. Here, Mary is the Queen of Heaven. She's wearing a crown. She's sitting on a throne-like structure. And here we have baby Jesus in front of his feet, a closed book, probably referring to the Old Testament, because this is the new covenant is beginning to happen. The cherries are a reference possibly to paradise. The rosary also a devotional practice, praying the rosary that went through all of the major events in the Christian, in the story of Christ and the story of Mary, including the Passion. And here we see the baby Jesus with this beautiful gesture, holding his mother's little finger in a very human, touching way. Mary offering the milk of her breast, but as a very human activity. But Christ is turning away. He's looking instead up here at these two angels who are presenting him with symbols of the Passion. So this isn't just, a Madonna and child. It's full of layers of meaning and would invite reflection on the part of the viewer of, these mysteries and the fact that Christ, for man's redemption, turned away from, he turned towards embracing his divine destiny. And this, these meanings, when we look at, a Christmas card with Mary and Jesus, we don't necessarily immediately evoke all of those layers of meaning. And in Isabel's Spain, this is what a serious, pious viewer would have followed that language through this, to experience the story in their own reflections and contemplation. So this is replete with many allusions to the Passion, and it's painted in a rather clear, precise way compared to some other works by Berruguete. This is where we get into the mystery man side of Berruguete. We're pretty sure he had to go to Italy, and we're pretty sure that he was the Pietro Spagnolo in Urbino, documented in Urbino. And there are paintings in Urbino, which I'm going to show you in a minute, that really do seem very, very Italianate, and maybe by his hand. But when he came back to Spain, he didn't really paint like an Italian anymore. He reverted to a lot of qualities that were present in Castilian painting before he went away. At the same time, in almost contemporary works, he's painting in a much more Italianate way. I mean, this, if you compare the two babies, the child on the right, this panel's in the Prado, is the volume of his little limbs is much more convincing. The drawing is more correct. The actual placing of three-dimensional reality into two dimensions is more convincing. And this would seem to be the more natural post-Italy painting. But this is also dated by the specialists of Berruguete as a post-Italy painting. So the conclusion that's been reached is that artists in Spain were not just painting the way any old how that they wanted to do. They really were responding to preferences expressed by patrons. And the patron might be an individual, or it might be a religious order. But there were different styles that the same artist could express depending on the specifics of the patron-artist relationship or agreement in any given case. And there'll be a couple of other examples of that soon. Okay, very quickly, these are some of the disputed works from the Mystery Man in Urbino. And these are incredibly Italianate. I mean, this is, the drawing here is perfect. The sort of cool analytical light that is falling throughout and revealing the forms and describing the forms is just completely Italian. But these three works, this is in the National Gallery, London, and these two are both in Urbino still, have been much, much disputed whether Pietro Spagnolo really could have painted these and still be Pedro Berruguete, or whether this is by another artist also working in Urbino. So if anybody feels really curious and like doing lots of fundamental looking for documents, this would be a good subject to research. However, it's also really important to remember that these artists were not, they were not doing self-expression. That is not what they did. They were working in a culture where iconography was very closely prescribed, where the patron had a lot to say about things, or if not the patron directly, maybe a humanist who would, or a cleric, a theologian who would design the program. In many, many ways, the role of the artist was partly being a creative individual, but he was also being someone who executed a complex plan. And this is certainly the case in Urbino. Many times, all of this work is way too much for one person to do alone. So in Urbino, at the Ducal Palace and the Ducal commissions, or working on one of those huge Castilian altarpieces in Spain, that's not the work of one person. It's got to be, a kind of corporate undertaking, and the documentation in Spain is rich with these examples, where a kind of master painter signs the contract with the commission, whoever commissions it, and then he subcontracts to his cousin, who's a panel maker, and his brother-in-law who does the altarpiece architecture, and then his son's a really good gilder, so he does the gilding. And one artist might or might not do all the underdrawing, but lots of different artists might do the paint application. There's the sense of individual authorship that we sometimes project back to these earlier periods. That's a post-romantic idea. That's our idea about artistic expression. In earlier ages, a few people could get away with that kind of diva behavior, like Michelangelo, but usually it could be a corporate undertaking. And and people would come together for the duration of that commission, and when the commission was over, their working relationship finished until they had another one, and then maybe a different cousin would be brought in. But that's how and that's why the guild system was so important. So authorship, to be able to say, oh, this whole thing was definitely done by Pedro Berruguete, it's not historically realistic, because he could have the design idea, but the execution of every single thing, it's almost impossible. And also in very fine, artists with a lot of ability would be aware that they're working next door to, Joe, who might have a much heavier contour than I have, but we have to make it all look as one piece. So Sam over here might lighten his contour, or make his contour heavier, and get Joe to lighten his contour a little bit, so that it would all mesh together as a final whole. So those are all caveats on authorship. Okay, here we have genuine Berruguete back in Spain, two predella figures from one of the big altarpieces that we absolutely know he painted. And even here, the treatment of the physiognomy and the flesh tones is slightly different. They're absolutely Berruguete. Berruguete signed the contract for this altarpiece. We know that he was certainly the chief if he didn't execute every single stroke of paint. And here, this is a detail of that hand flipped around, and the sensibility, the way the anatomy is described, it's very, very similar. But, in the absence of documentary proof, art historians are very loath to commit themselves. But in any case, I feel it's very easy to say, I don't find it difficult to say that there's evidence here of someone who had to have learned about drawing somewhere other than central Spain. And the only place that people were really drawing this well in the mid-15th century was in central Italy. Oh, sorry, those are just, two examples of the sort of great big projects that might be corporate undertakings. This is another example of Berruguete's draftsmanship, which I think is the single strongest argument for this artist to have been in Italy. Oops, sorry. Something funny is happening here. On your right is this, I've made something disappear. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. I made a drawing disappear. This is a detail of this painting, which is one of 4 monumental scale canvas paintings, but they're not painted in oil. They're painted in a water-based medium, which is also not tempera. It's gum or glue. So instead of mixing the pigment in egg, it's mixed in gum or glue. This is the single most unforgiving medium that an artist can use. It really, there's no room for correction. Once you put a stroke on the canvas, there's no ground to speak of. It's fixed there, so you have to know how to draw. And this is definitely Berruguete. And this draftsmanship, the way everything is placed in space, even with the deterioration of the paint layer, the drawing is absolutely true. And this, I think, you only learn in central Italy at that time. And I'm just showing you here a detail of a drawing by Domenico Ghirlandaio, who was active in central Italy at this time. And some of the qualities of contour and the way the structure of the face is understood in these 2 details from Berruguete. Finally, besides this knowledge of Central Italian draftsmanship, which we see in everything in Spain that is attributed to Berruguete convincingly, we also find a knowledge of an ability to use some of the qualities of northern painting, the richness and use of transparency and blending that's possible with oil paint. And here you see a painting that was done for Isabel, which she gave to the convent of the monastery of Carthusian monastery near Burgos of Miraflores. And here he's clearly working in a kind of imitating Van Eyck, which was probably done as at the Queen's request, because, as I'm going to tell you in just a moment, the Queen and her family had a very, very strong attachment to everything to do with Northern art. It was a matter of devotion, what helped their devotion, but also it was a kind of dynastic identity, because her father liked Flemish art and her grandfather liked Flemish art. She too was going to, it was a kind of a badge of being a member of that dynasty. And just this was also painted just in the same years when Juan de Flandes comes to work for Isabel. Pedro Berruguete is active in that court circle, so he also received the patronage of Isabel directly, but especially also of courtiers who were close to her. He was doing something right that struck the right note with the image makers, the culture makers of Isabel's reign. And this is a very beautiful painting that's recently gone into the Prado. For many, many years it was in the Municipal Museum in Madrid. And it's a rather wonderful example of this kind of Gothic, is this Gothic? Kind of Gothic architecture, and then the ceiling is absolutely Moorish. you know, and this is true in Spain. You know, if you walk into a 15th century building or a 15th century church, you look up at the ceiling and the architecture, you know, the ceiling architecture is completely, you know, Islamic, because the artisans who were doing that work were traditionally, you know, all of Isabel's carpenters were had Arabic surnames, because they were the mudéjar, skilled craftsmen. Okay. So I'm just going to show you very quickly. This is the famous Charterhouse of Miraflores, which was for Isabel, for her father, for her grandfather. It was a receptacle for family piety. Her grandfather had requested his son, Isabel's father, to establish a foundation there. Both her grandfather and the father, I think, wanted to be buried there. So there were testamentary provisions that Isabel finally completed fulfilling just before her death. It was both a source of dynastic and religious identity for her and for her family. Okay, I see I'm running out of time, so I'm going to... So Isabel commissioned the altarpiece, of which the Baptism of Christ that's upstairs from the Abello collection was the center of the altarpiece. This is another source, this is another location for kind of disputed authorship. We know that Juan de Flandes signed the agreement. The paperwork has all got his name on it. But, and he was commissioned by Isabel to paint this for Miraflores convent. Many specialists have seen different hands in some of these figures, specifically the hand of Michael Sittow, who was also a court painter in Isabel's court and who did have collaborative relationship with Juan de Flandes. However, most recently, the Flandes specialists do believe that the whole altarpiece was done by Juan de Flandes. One of the things that is exceptional about this is the monumental scale, the amazing perspective of how we're meant to see the whole ensemble. And it was set into a specific part of the convent which would have access to lay people. So its intended audience was a lay public. The 4 panels have only recently, since the Second World War, have they all been identified and brought together. This one's in Cleveland, this one's in Budapest, I think, this one is in Geneva, and this one is in Antwerp. And this is a story of the dispersion of works of art from Spain. This convent was pretty seriously sacked by Napoleon's troops during the Peninsular Wars. So it's actually rather miraculous that all 5 parts of this altarpiece have been recovered. I mean, they've been identified, and they can be brought together at some point. I don't think they've ever been displayed all together. Also in Miraflores, another example of Isabel's family sort of commitment and taste for northern painting is this triptych. It's called the Miraflores triptych because it came from there, although it's now in a museum in Berlin. And the main point here is that Isabel, I think, before asking Juan de Flandes to paint the altarpiece, asked him to make a copy of this triptych, which had been commissioned by her father. She wanted a copy to stay with her when the original went to Granada. And it's very intriguing to me to see how versatile Juan de Flandes really is. You know, you wouldn't mistake those two for the same hand, but it's a very, very interesting dialogue between, let's face it, one supreme artist. I mean, Roger van der Weyden was an epoch-making artist. And then Juan de Flandes, who carried that sensibility with him from Flanders to Spain, but he was a later generation, he was working in Spain, he was working with a different kind of light, a different, the original audience for his copy was different than the original audience for the kinds of images that Roger van der Weyden made. And again, just a comparison of a detail of the head of Christ from the copy and the head of the angel in the painting upstairs. One of the really big works that Juan de Flandes did for Isabel of Castile was the famous polyptych little retablo of originally, I think, 47 small paintings. This is how they've most recently been shown, and this was how they were shown earlier in the 20th century. Originally, when they were inventoried in Isabel's collection, they were all separate little panels kept in a cupboard. So the original function of these many, many panels with scenes from the life of Christ and the life of Mary, it's not clear how Isabel intended to use them. They were, in her life, they were not mounted into a little altarpiece, but they're an incredible treasure of invention and execution by a really wonderful artist who, at this time, Juan de Flandes, had to have pretty regular contact and conversation with Queen Isabel. So it's a rather marvelous patron-artist relationship that's manifested in these panels. I'm not going to talk about the panels for too long. I'll just show you here one example. And these, the panels are the size of, an 8.5 by 11 or smaller. Actually, they're more like this size. So they're intimate. They're almost like, reading a book or looking at an illuminated manuscript. These have been very, very carefully studied in all the different institutions where they're owned today. The largest group is owned by the Patrimonio Nacional, but they're just about half of them are still together at the Patrimonio Nacional, and then all the rest are 2 or 3 here or 1 there, and probably about 12 are lost altogether, as far as we know now. So I mentioned before, I showed you that one example of underdrawing. This is a really interesting argument that has been made. These paintings, these tiny paintings, made for Isabel's personal use. We don't know exactly how she imagined viewing these images, 1 by 1, 6 at a time, all of them assembled somehow. We don't know. That's a mystery. But what we do know is that in almost all of them, the underdrawing, which you see an image of here for the marriage, the wedding at Cana, is somewhat more complicated than the final image. There's always a step of simplification. One of the characteristics of Juan de Flandes is that little by little, he creates, his figures are isolated in space. They gain a monumentality that's not absolutely at home in the Flemish idiom. And it's interesting to see, and these are some of the first things that he did in Spain, how, for example, he suppressed this much more ornate architecture for a much simpler backdrop that helps to focus the attention on the important interaction that's occurring here. Also here, you can see there was a dog, which might have seemed too anecdotal, because remember, he would be discussing back and forth with Isabel or with Isabel's spiritual advisors, what's the correct sort of decorous way to represent this scene. So he simplifies detail, and little by little, on a larger scale, he creates much greater space around his figures. This is another example of the raising of Lazarus. Sorry, this is 1510 to 1515. So almost 10 years after Isabel's death, and this is Isabel's raising of Lazarus. You can see the real difference here. The face of Martha, I think that's who this is meant to be, who's Lazarus's sister. You know, she's rather pleased and somewhat serene and complacent. And here, there's a new psychology. There is, you know, this miracle of Christ, raising of Lazarus, was really the event that set off the chain of the dramatic chain that led to the Passion. And this is Juan de Flandes embedding that meaning in the narrative of the biblical story. This is also, I think, an increasingly a characteristic that survives in Spanish art, this sort of seriousness and layering of meaning with relatively simple composition. Again, just a contrast of comparison between the head of the angel upstairs and then how much more loosely, I mean, the scale is not fair. This is smaller in scale than the angel. But the way the paint is used to create form is much more loosely executed. It's not as tightly closed up as in the more Flemish, more highly detailed technique that we see here. Okay, the last artist is going to be Yáñez de la Almedina. In this case, we have an independent composition done also probably as a devotional work for a small intimate setting, not unlike that chapel of Ferdinand and Isabel that I showed you early on. Yáñez de la Almedina, de la Almedina, is credited for introducing Leonardesque technique, pictorial language, draftsmanship to Spain, to the Kingdom of Aragon, to Valencia, and to parts of eastern Castile. Nevertheless, he is distinctly Iberian when he gets home. We know that he is a Spaniard, that he is not an Italian working in Spain. And this is one of the characteristics. I mean, I think it's not always easy to put into words, you know, what is it that we see that tells us that this is a Spaniard and not an Italian? But there is something in Yáñez de la Almedina, despite his absolute fluency with the language of Leonardesque forms, the way he executes, the light he uses, something is distinctively Spanish. Now, we know that so his little hook, the little hook that he hangs on in Italy is this one documentary mention of Ferrando Spagnolo, who got paid by Leonardo by the town hall of Florence for helping Leonardo paint, and it says distinctly paint, the Battle of Anghiari. Now, the Battle of Anghiari was a very important civic commission in Florence. Unfortunately, the original has been destroyed, but it had a huge impact on artists for a couple of hundred years after that. In particular, I'm showing you here, this is Rubens's drawing and copy and painting taken from the Battle of Anghiari while it still existed in 100 years after it was painted. So that's where Yáñez de la Almedina we believe was working with Leonardo on that commission. And if we look closely at Yáñez and look closely at Leonardo, we see a lot of importation into his compositions of Leonardesque details. Nevertheless, the whole does not make up a copy of a Leonardo or an imitation Leonardo. The sum of the parts is more than that. So this is a drawing, you know, Leonardo's great interest in character types, Here, this painting's been in the news a lot in the last couple of years. It seems to be a genuine Leonardo, but very, very compromised state. Again, here, the hands breaking through to engage, to sort of convince for a moment to the viewer that the picture plane is not there, that they're in a shared space, which creates intimacy and is sort of a way of persuading the viewer of the reality that's represented inside of the painting. And again here, just another example of that hand. I'll just say very quickly that in the this is a very unusual iconography. It seems like a very specific commission, because usually, this is a much more typical way to see Christ represented as Salvator Mundi. Here he's accompanied by two saints, Saint Peter, who was always depicted as an elderly man, and Saint John the Evangelist, always depicted, often depicted as a young man. There are lots of theories. Does Saint John represent the contemplative life? I think in a life of religion, and Saint Peter the active life. I mean, he built, he was the foundation stone of the church, whereas Saint John the Evangelist was definitely, he withdrew, he was a hermit, he wrote his gospel. It was a different kind of life. Whether we can actually project, we don't have any contemporary texts that elucidate, why would you put these three characters together? So it's a lot of, it's open to interpretation, but it is a very unusual representation because, Saint Peter and Saint John the Evangelist are shown as they were on earth, whereas in this depiction, Christ he's already the glorified Christ, the Salvator Mundi representation. It's a kind of odd mixture of iconographical elements, which makes it very, very fascinating. Just another example of this Leonardo, a detail of the painting from the Abello collection, and this is a detail of another painting that up until the last 20 years or so was certainly considered probably an Italian painting, but now it's been accepted by Yanez scholars, certainly by Yanez scholars, as a Yanez, but a Yanez painted in Italy. Okay, the way that information, pictorial information, was transmitted, I mean, by the next generation, there were lots of prints circulating all over Europe. At this stage, in the 1490s and the early 1500s, probably artists didn't own prints, but they would make copies of drawings or studies that they could carry with them that would be part of their professional endowment, really. It was part of the goods that they could work with. And any artist who went abroad to study would do lots of sketches. And this is actually a drawing by Leonardo, but you can see how it was used in the Yanez workshop to inform the figure of Christ. It's also an unusual iconography of Christ going to limbo and presenting the souls in limbo to the prayers of his mother. Ooh, I've lost some images. I think I better skip over that one. Yanez did a huge commission. All of these guys, their bread and butter, their day-to-day work was usually painting giant altarpieces. This one in Valencia Cathedral is a real beauty. It's really, really impressive. Those are all giant panels. I mean, they're about 2 meters by 1.5 meters. And in this case, it was definitely too much for Yanez to do, and so he teamed up with somebody who is another source of confusion. This is Fernando Llanos. So Fernando Llanos and Fernando Yanez So you can imagine how confusing it is with documents that are usually written in phonetic Spanish or phonetic Valencian. But this seems to be clearly a commission signed by Yáñez, but there are definitely at least two hands at work here. And they've tried to blend. So it's an if you're ever in Valencia, it is really breathtaking, and it's Yáñez, writ large, because it's certainly his. We think it's his overall design, and so the panels make up these two doors. So they're painted on both sides, and these doors swing open and shut. And this is actually just a montage of a drawing of the original 16th century silver relief altarpiece that was melted down to make coin in 1812. But but this altarpiece was like the most precious thing in the cathedral, so it would only be uncovered on holy days and special feasts. On holy days and special feasts. So most of the time, this is what was seen, but the inside images and the silver relief panel, that in this case is about 15 feet high, was just kind of a wonder of Spain. It was very, very beautiful. And here is an example of Yáñez working on a more monumental scale. This is one of the panels showing the Dormition of the Virgin. A lot of Italian references. We would call it a homage today, but they were cross-referencing, and he was redeploying all kinds of Italian elements in here. This figure, many of these figures can be identified in Central Italian art, not just in Leonardo. Okay, that's just Fernando Llanos, the other guy who sounds almost exactly the same. So the artists that we've looked at, Berruguete, Juan de Flandes, and Yáñez de la Almedina, I think that they were a key generation. While Isabel was trying to shape Spain and unify Spain and create a homogeneous national identity, because as you saw in some of those earlier maps, Spain was a kind of patchwork for hundreds and hundreds of years. As she was trying to create a national identity, these artists were struggling and creating images that had a specifically Spanish character. The sort of serious intensity of religious feeling. It's not dramatic religious feeling, but it's very intense and it's very sincere. That's one characteristic. Another characteristic is, the placing of individual figures in space. There's not a lot of overcrowding on the whole in Spanish. Think of Velázquez. How his, so many of his figures just are portraits of a figure against a blank background. There's something that carries on that I think is at the heart, part of what's at the heart of Spanish sensibility. They created a kind of foundation, these three artists, which allowed the next generation, artists like Juan de Juanes, working in Valencia, to create a really strongly Spanish style that was fluent with lots of other European idioms, but it was specifically Spanish in inflection. And Juan de Juanes was a meaningful master who really set much of what happened later in Valencia, especially his draftsmanship, I think, is incredibly important for Spain. But this is a very beautiful panel. It's just, the sort of subdued drama, the decorum, the restraint with which emotion is expressed. These are all, I think, very characteristic of Spanish art. You have a beautiful Juan de Juanes upstairs from a little bit earlier than this painting, which is in the Prado. Or Luis de Morales, this is also upstairs. It's one of the paintings I worked on in the Abello collection. But this is very early Morales. And then, this is mature Morales. Morales never left Spain, and he's one of the most distinctive Spanish artists that there has ever been. He might not be to everybody's taste, but he is really the authentic thing in Spain. And he, I think as an artist, represents many of these characteristics. The sort of understatement, slightly restrained expression of emotion. There's nothing hysterical in Spanish art. It's very decorum conscious. So I just will conclude with this comparison between our early Berruguete, and I think we can find the same reliance on a firm description of forms in space. The atmosphere that surrounds them is defined, if not always illustrated, and above all, the sort of serious intent embedded in the layered iconography that's embedded in a rather naturalistic image. This is all part of what I think is visible and was given to Spain by the traveled artists, the mystery men of the late 15th century. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry I over-talked. Oh, yeah. Yes?
Do you mean to say that doors have the both sides?
Yes.
You have paintings on both sides?
Yes.
On each one of the sides?
Yes. Yes. So, yeah, it's a double, each section is a double-sided painting. So it's one panel with painting on both sides set into the carpentry framework.
That Isabel commissioned.
Yes.
You said they were.
Possibly. She was certainly still itinerant at the time that she commissioned them. They were inventoried, at the end of her life. But yeah, I mean, their mobility, certainly that's one feature of, being that size, that's very mobile. But they're so variable. They could be combined in so many different ways. It's really intriguing to think how they would have been used. But I'm sure that you're right, that they would be easy to transport on, and they went on litters, I mean, they didn't have even carriages because the roads were too bad. So to go from A to B, if you were a queen, you either rode a horse or you sat in a litter that was held on two horses. And if you were lucky, you got to go on a Roman road, but there were only a few of those in Spain, and otherwise, it was, it's a rough terrain. So, any other questions? Oh. Not at all.
Have they tried to fingerprint some of the possessions just for biographies or for document
You mean like looking for DNA or something like that? I have no idea, because, I don't know how you would get Isabel's DNA to test that, or get a fingerprint from, no, I'm sure that, how would you know whether that's Isabel's fingerprint or not? They've certainly looked at things, and they've compared inventories. And then, with things like these little panels, they've got provenance, they've got a history in some cases that can be traced. The ones that have gone back to the Royal Collection were acquired by Isabel's niece, I think, at the sale of her goods, of Isabel's goods. So we know they went from Isabel's inventory, they went to the niece, and from the niece they went to either Charles I or Philip II, and then they went back to Spain. So there's not very much doubt about those, but other things I don't know. Okay, thank you.
It helps me orient myself more to this place and appreciate it more.
It's so wonderful. I mean, it's just breathtaking. You know, the youngest up there is in the permanent collection. It's beautiful. So, I'm so glad you came.
Oh, it's a gift that you were here. Thank you, Debbie. Thank you so much for coming up.
Trying to think of the job that I was doing Catholic for the day of my life and restorations for years. So, yeah. Oh, the pleasure. I found out it existed because of the floods in Florence. I read an article describing